The Caroleans, The Strengths and Weaknesses by Brandon F. Let's go. If you want to go see more content or bonus clips, go over to our Patreon. Links in the description box down below.
You forgot the gapa in the top.
Yeah, I weren't going to try that. I just didn't want to, just in case.
The elite forces of the Swedish Empire, the famed legions of Carolans.
Nice.
It was a rather short-lived army which ultimately failed, and yet it still captures the imagination of so many today. And while it certainly helps, their immense popularity probably owes itself to more than just a heavy metal album or two. Rather, the legacy of this force lingers because of the impact it
Oh, mate, that has
because
such
of
a beautiful
how they were able to punch above their weight for so long, able to repeatedly crush foes multiple times their own size. Their glory, yes, was short-lived, and it was also extraordinary. But while the reputation of the Caroleans is strong, and the rough outline of their story is relatively well known, again, largely I think thanks to a certain Swedish boot, what is generally less known is how the Caroleans actually operated.
Okay,
Why did they even come into existence? How did they fight? What were their techniques? Why were they so efficient? And of course, a less popular subject to discuss, what were their weaknesses? As indeed, there did have to be some kind of flaw in those immortal soldiers of the Swedish Empire. Otherwise, you'd have to wonder how they ever lost in the first place. So, what was the
I think that was anyone's weaknesses.
Defeat? Well, first things first, let's discuss their origins. Now, funnily enough, the story of the Caroleans doesn't start, as you may expect, during the height of the Swedish Empire, the early to mid-17th century, but actually towards the beginning of its end. You see, the term Carolean comes, as you may expect, from the name Carolus, or Charles, and more specifically from King Charles XI and King Charles XII. You see, they find their roots in the aftermath of the costly Scanian War, a term I probably just mispronounced, in which Sweden, allied with France, fought against the Danes and the Norwegians, the Dutch, and multiple Germanic states. It's a complicated history, but for our purposes here, suffice to say that the war was very costly for Sweden. They suffered many losses which could not be easily replaced by a nation with relatively low manpower and low resources, and especially when compared to their neighbors in Denmark and more notably in Germany and even in Russia, which was soon to enter the stage in a very big way, but we'll get to the Russians soon enough, not to worry. You see, Charles XI, who was ruler at the time, realized that if the Swedish Empire was ever going to compete and retain its capacity as a great power, then being militarily dominant in a traditional fashion would not be enough for it. It would need to start punching well above its own weight to maintain that status. So he began instituting a series of economic and military reforms in Sweden aimed at achieving precisely that, greater levels of efficiency. Now, one of the most significant of these reforms he instituted was the method in which the Swedish army recruited, which was called the allotment system. Now, prior to Charles XI's reforms, under what is now referred to as the old system, the Swedish military grouped together 10 men of military age from every state or farm. Now, this collection of 10 men was called a rote, or a rote. Rote, something like that. And in the event of war, one of these 10 men would be conscripted for service in the army. Now, theoretically, this man would be chosen at random out of this collection of 10 men capable of military service. However, a system by which a man might purchase, or indeed bribe his way out of selection, meant that it may only ever be the poorest men who were actually being conscripted into the army. And in the event that this practice was truly random, as it was meant to be, well, it was hardly conducive to veterancy, or even to standardization, as of course you could be getting a different soldier every individual campaign. And those two things, veterancy and standardization, are becoming increasingly significant towards the end of the 17th century, and indeed throughout the 18th century. Now, to combat these problems, Charles XI completely reformed the allotment system in the 1680s. This new system, as it's called, kept the same idea of the rote. The concept was the same, but it altered how the rotes were actually formed.
Okay.
You see, rather than being a small selection of military-aged men from every individual community, now the entire community represented a single rote, and every individual rote, say an estate or again a collection of farms, was given the duty of supplying a single soldier. This soldier was not conscripted, but they were usually a volunteer, and they were not randomly selected out of 10 men who just happened to be capable of doing military service, but he was a dedicated and professional soldier.
Okay.
This one man who took on military duties on behalf of his entire community was outfitted by that community, not only with a home and a farm, but with his uniform and other necessaries for military service. And the chief duties of these men consisted of attending drills, which usually lasted for about a month out of every single year, and of course fielding for regular service during times of actual war. So again,
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting way of doing it.
It actually is.
Yeah, because it makes your community feel more prideful of the people they're sending, and also it makes you who is doing it feel like, yeah, just feel, I don't know how to explain it, but you would,
I know what you're trying to explain. I
yeah,
think.
like you would feel so prideful in the fact that you're defending and you're this representative of your community.
Yeah.
You know,
And it's not just 10 random people.
that's it. And then
that are
as well, the fact that they look after you, it feels appreciated that you're putting
you
your
feel
life.
good that you're going to do your service.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of doing it. That's really cool. And again, it's like sort of like the Hunger Games, where the first 2 districts are trained, and it's like honourable to volunteer.
Yeah.
You know, you are gonna, if you know that's what you're going to be doing, you're going to take it more seriously, and you're going to be a much stronger fighter as well.
Yeah.
So you're going to get more out of that person. So yeah, I think it's a benefit for both the community and the government, and it's a really interesting way of doing things.
again, rather than having an individual community put up 10 people for potential
You can't see the video, guys.
military service, but their primary lives are as craftsmen and as farmers, as you'd expect. Rather, every individual community is putting up one person, and that is all they do. They are a soldier. You know, yes, they also have a farm and whatnot, but they are much more dedicatedly a soldier, and the community is based around supporting them in that endeavor. Of course, there were exceptions to this recruitment policy, with both the Guards regiments, for example, and artillery regiments often recruiting in a more traditional style, as we've come to expect with other European powers. But these reforms overall represented a much more efficient use of Sweden's limited manpower pool, and at the same time they reduced the overall cost of maintenance and supply for the army, sort of decentralizing it all, while also allowing the army to become much more professional. Again, no longer are these men randomly selected, but they are continually providing service. It was out of these reforms that the new
He is rocking up to the Met Gala looking divine.
Exquisite.
Exquisite.
Carolean army was born. But of course, even with this increased efficiency and the professionalism at this organizational level, the Swedish army would still face problems of being vastly outnumbered by most of their neighbors. After all, they're not increasing their manpower, the number of rotes, and as such soldiers, is not expanding here in any way, they're just using that manpower more efficiently. And so to be truly competitive, Charles XI would also need to reform how his army operated at a more tactical level.
And is this where we're going to get into the Caroleans?
And the new fighting style developed would be called gå på, and it would immortalize the Caroleans as one of the most fearsome, disciplined, and zealous armies of its day. Now, the basic principles of the gå på, which again I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, were very simple. You see, translated, the term directly means go on, or go to. It emphasized rapid and decisive strikes against an enemy to disorganize and push them from the field before their inevitably greater numbers could condense and overwhelm the Swedish forces. And now, before we get into it, please understand that this explanation is of the ideal doctrine, and there were likely many, many different examples in which the Caroleans fought very differently as circumstances dictated. But broadly speaking, a Swedish battalion would form up 4 ranks deep. Now, this is a deep formation, but it's certainly not uncommon in the time period that they were operating in. The majority of this line, as you'd expect, were musketmen in the traditional style, with small groupings of grenadiers on the flanks and potentially at the van of the force, doing things like defending against cavalry and throwing grenades. Indeed, they were still using grenades in the early 18th century, unlike the late 18th century, which many of my own viewers are a bit more accustomed to. However, interestingly enough, around 1 in every 3 of the Carolean infantry were actually dedicated pikemen. And this is in a day and age where the use of pikes in linear warfare was very solidly dying out.
So
in the
why-
past,
why
of
were
course,
they
pikes
used?
would move alongside the muskets to protect them from cavalry, but the expanding prevalence of bayonets was lowering this need, and the increasing demands of mobility, again, standardization, and above all else, firing capacity meant that the age of pike and shot was already starting to die out by the mid-17th century, and by the time of the 18th it was largely finished. But these Swedish pikes would form their own full companies, and they were either deployed throughout the line, or they could even be massed together in the very center of the line.
Interesting.
Now, if their only job was to defend the muskets from cavalry, this would be horrible placement, as you'd want to have them on the more vulnerable flanks, and again, dispersed throughout the force to protect the muskets. And in particular, you'd never want to have such a massive portion of your line rendered completely impotent in a firefight by having it consist
So what was their
only
use
of
then?
melee soldiers. But this isn't how the Caroleans used them. Rather, the Caroleans used their pikes not as defensive units, which was the traditional way they were always used in pike and shot warfare. Rather, the Caroleans used their pikemen in a very offensive capacity.
How
The
so?
Caroleans didn't want to fight at range. They didn't want long, drawn-out firefights. Their emphasis was always on the charge, getting stuck in with the enemy in a melee fight. And that is the one place where the reach of a pike actually gives it a definitive edge over a musket with a bayonet.
see.
You see, the Caroleans would form their line and begin advancing towards their enemy. Now, naturally, an enemy volley is going to have significant effect when the Swedes are within, say, 75 to 125 yards, or
Yep.
thereabouts, again, very roughly speaking. But unlike most armies of the day, the Caroleans wouldn't stop at that range and then begin exchanging fire with the enemy. They keep on marching through the fire until they are within around 50 yards of their enemy, well within an effective range. And while the enemy is likely still reloading from what's probably their second volley at that point, if they're doing well, the rear 2 ranks of Carolean musketmen would step forward through gaps left specifically in the front ranks of the Caroleans, and they would fire their own volley. Now, likely this would be a very, very efficient one. Certainly much more efficient than the first volley which the enemy threw against them, and potentially more than the enemy's second volley as well, assuming that they were even able to get it off before the Caroleans halted. Then the rear ranks would step back into their places, and rather than reload their pieces, they would draw their swords. Now, in these earlier years, the majority of the Caroleans did not actually have bayonets, but carried rapiers at their side, and I assume that they would be slinging their muskets across their backs
love a
before
rapier
drawing
in
them,
war.
rather than drop the muskets to the ground,
Yeah.
but I couldn't find any information exactly on where they would put them. But suffice to say, they do not reload, they draw swords, ready again for a melee. The
One
rear
bullet
2
is
ranks
enough.
having done so, the force again would take up the advance. This time, it's a very short distance that they go, a very quickly closed distance, to around 20 yards from the enemy. Now, the front 2 ranks would fire, and being right up on the enemy like that, that second Carolean volley would be utterly devastating.
Yep.
Now, if the
Point
plan is
blank
going
range,
well,
pretty
by
much.
this time the enemy line is in complete disarray. The Swedes are moving quickly. They're not reloading, but they fire 2 volleys in very quick succession. Again, these men are well trained. They're very good at what they do. Odds are the enemy have only fired at most 3 volleys within an effective range at this point, and probably nowhere near so effective as that final volley was of the Caroleans at only 20 yards away. And while the enemy is in that disarray, they're trying to reload for their own close-range volley, then the Caroleans charge in, through the smoke, with bayonet, sword, and pike. And with the initiative, with zeal, they drive the enemy from the field. Again, these men are well disciplined. They are well ordered, well maintained. And they are applying a
Well
great
armed.
deal of force at a very
Well armed,
particular
mate.
point in the enemy's line, particularly again with those offensive pikes. Even the Swedish cavalry was emphasizing similar tactics. They would pack themselves much tighter in formation than most other forces of the day.
Interesting.
It's actually said that their squadrons were placed knee behind knee instead of the more traditional wider spacing, and they would rarely ever use skirmishing tactics with their pistols and carbines, but preferred instead charging directly into the foe with their swords. In later years, for example during the Great Northern War against Russia, King Charles XII, Carolus Rex, would make even further changes to the tactics. He had his men form much tighter ranks for much stronger charges. He increased the use of bayonets over the rapier, which is much better in terms of the reach offered in a melee fight.
Okay.
He tightened the ranges of the fights even more dramatically, firing his own first volleys at only 20 yards instead of at 50. And he would even have his men run into that range instead of slowly march there in order to reduce the casualties taken in those earlier stages of the battles when the Caroleans were at their most vulnerable. When these techniques worked, they allowed the Swedish army to defeat, rout, and even force the surrender of forces much larger than their own. They regularly defeated armies twice, 3, even 4 times their size throughout the early days of the 18th century.
Just because
and oftentimes they were doing it with extraordinary casualty ratios as well, such as, for example, at the Battle of Narva in 1700, where up to 18,000 Russians became casualties, but under 2,000 Swedes were lost. There was the Battle of Warsaw in 1705, with 1,000 Saxon casualties to just around 300 Swedish. Or the Crossing of the Duna, 1701, 2,000 casualties to only 500. The list goes on. Again, the Swedish were continually, during this time period, punching
literally just slapping people about.
They relied above all else on extreme discipline, on cohesion, and indeed courage within their ranks. They had to. They couldn't afford to raise anywhere near the number of soldiers that their enemies could. The soldiers that they did have had to count. But all the same, as we said earlier, the days of the Caroleans truly were the final days of the Swedish Empire.
Interesting.
But with how we've described them thus far, how can that be? Why, they sound almost invincible. Why didn't every army immediately adopt these Carolean methods? Why didn't the Swedes crush the Russians in the Great Northern War, retain their status as a great power? Well, as much as fans of those certain heavy metal bands would hate to admit it, the Caroleans were very far from perfect. And the tactics and strategies of men like Carolus Rex, while they were very impressive, also had many flaws.
So
and
let's see
ultimately,
these weaknesses.
These flaws would lead to their defeat and annihilation. First, we'll talk about the tactical weaknesses and why the Carolean style of warfare did not come to dominate.
I mean, because they were just running into volleys.
Yes, certain
There's only
aspects
so
of the
many
game
men you
were
can
during
lose.
this time period.
Unless you were with Carlos Rex or Charles the 12th.
It would have backfired regardless, but
Over
it would have been a
time-
lot easier if you just legged it first.
Yeah, but just over time, eventually you're going to start losing too many men.
Just imagine just marching, well, Dave, how's the wife? Well, you know. What about you, Paul?
Yeah.
Paul? Bollocks.
Why didn't we just run?
Yeah, lights out, mate. Like, no.
I see you. You haven't liked the video yet. Why not? Go on, go like it. While you're at it, you know you want to subscribe. And if you want to go to our social medias, all the links you need are in the description box down below. And you might as well head over to our Patreon as well, where you can get extra bonus content if you're enjoying this. That link's in the description box down below. But we'll get straight back into the video. Love you guys.
Then we'll go on to the larger, more existential, strategic weaknesses of how Sweden carried out its campaigns. The thing about the Caroleans is that on paper, yes, they were incredible. When you describe the basic principles of their strategies in a vacuum, as we did just earlier, it does indeed make them sound invincible.
Of course, but when it goes wrong,
warfare
what
is not
happens?
fought in a vacuum. At least not yet. And we all know that even the soundest of doctrines tend to unravel a little bit when meeting first contact with the enemy. Let's talk a little bit more about those pikes. Now, if you can maintain the Gaupo momentum, drive forward, reach the enemy lines, as long as they kept their good order, that concentrated mass of long-reach melee soldiers will perform excellently. But what if they don't? What if the
It's a
line
bunch of men,
falters?
you ain't got fire
What
and
if
muskets.
the charge breaks? What if elements of it get bogged down here and there under overwhelming fire from an enemy? All of a sudden, as we've mentioned earlier, you've just rendered a third of your force completely impotent. Odds are the Caroleans are already outnumbered, which means any sort of protracted engagement will not end in their favor. And if the pikes are massed, suddenly you've just rendered an entire section of your line, the center of it for goodness sake, incapable of providing support to the other sections unless they charge and commit themselves. This is why the bayonet actually wins out over the pike. It provides versatility.
Yep.
It means that individual companies of troops can perform a variety of different tasks. That if nothing else, if a charge seems to falter, at least they can still have some sort of effect on the battlefield by, well, firing their muskets. A pike is only really good for two things: defending from a charge or carrying one out. The former
Putting
is
heads on
purely responsive, and it is of no use to you if, like the Caroleans, you rely on seizing initiative in the battle and dictating how it is to be fought. You're always having to be on the offensive. And the latter is only practical in very particular circumstances. And once committed, it's very difficult to bring pikemen back from that charge, especially if they've got stuck in with the enemy. Now, of course, if you disperse your pikes throughout your line, as was often done, these issues are lessened, but you're still reducing your overall firepower by a third, and can easily run into situations where you have significant portions of your soldiery just standing around waiting for an opportunity to charge, while the musketmen are firing all around them. Again, these are some of the bigger reasons why these were the final days of the pike. And again, if you have all of your pikemen massed in your center, well, even if that charge carries on perfectly, you are still having a third of your line which is not able to send out any firepower, but is receiving an awful lot of it.
That's a good point.
If you're going up against a very disparate, poorly organized enemy, then that can be okay. But if you're going up against an enemy force which is well disciplined and is able to maintain a good, accurate rate of fire, well, your men are going to be suffering an awful lot, and then run up against an enemy which has suffered very few casualties, just really from artillery, up to that point.
Lose-lose.
While the musketmen on the flanks are going up against a disorganized enemy because of, they're suffering those two massive volleys from 50 and then 20 yards away, well, the pikemen are going up against a center which is presumably ready to fight, ready to go, and actually meet the enemy that's advancing on them, even if that enemy does have a disadvantage in terms of overall reach. Now let's circle back to a point we hinted to earlier, that idea of momentum. The Caroleans relied on strong momentum in their charge, but a charge can only really be carried on so much. It can only go on for so long.
What?
If you
Just
don't
looked at
have
that game.
or if you're going up against a well-prepared, fortified enemy, it will very possibly fail. For a good example, look at the Battle of Poltava, 1709, in which the Swedish forces came up against a Russian army which was well prepared for them. It was entrenched within 6 forts and 4 redoubts. Many of these fortifications were able to provide support to one another, crossfires. This is a nightmare situation for the Caroleans. Now, yes, they can push forward and take one of those redoubts just fine, and then another, and then even another. But after every single push, every time you try to move on to another redoubt, you become weakened. The men become tired. It becomes very rapidly an uphill struggle. In many circumstances, possibly literally an uphill struggle. They outnumbered the Russians, that may not be a problem. But the Caroleans are almost always outnumbered. They can only ever apply so much force in so many different places at any one given time. And at the Battle of Poltava, as those continued assaults on Russian positions across the line began to falter with increasing intensity, well, the Russians start to isolate.
Seems to me like...
That looks like an absolute clusterfuck.
Yeah, that does look like a massive fucking clusterfuck. It looks to me like, the way I'd explain it is like Russia is a sledgehammer, and seems like the Swedish are like a scalpel. Do you know what I mean? They go in, they take certain areas, they'll go and pressure the point that's going to be the most easy to cause the most damage, pressure that point, and once that vessel or that area blows and everyone runs, that's what they do. They basically want to cause a rout a lot of the time and get people to flee because they think, there's not much they can do.
Yeah, okay. Does make sense.
Isolate individual Swedish battalions and overwhelm them. They even got to reoccupy some of the redoubts that the Swedes took earlier, making it all the more difficult for the Swedes to carry on with and maintain any sense of momentum that they may have had earlier on in the battle. And this is all in a battle where the Swedes were only outnumbered 2-1. Now, yes, that's very bad odds, but they'd faced much worse situations before in terms of numbers alone. But the Caroleans are kind of like a glass cannon. If they break your line, if they turn your flanks and send you running with their rapid, hard-hitting charge, then you're done. You're finished. But that momentum can only be carried so far. Yes, they break through your first line, but what if there's a second line? And then a third line? And a fourth line. Eventually the Caroleans get bogged down. They get forced into those extended firefights which they so fear. They get isolated, cut off from other units. They get picked off, and ultimately they get destroyed. And the worst thing for the Swedish Empire is that it only has to happen to them once. They can only ever have one disaster. And now we come to the wider problem, the existential problem of the Caroleans. That there were only ever really between 40 to 50,000 of them at most. Remember, Sweden has to punch continually above its weight. It does not have the manpower or the resources to continually field and resupply armies much more massive than that. In the end, it doesn't exactly matter if you're able to get a casualty ratio of 3-1 if the enemy has 4 men for every one of yours and they're willing to carry on the war. You will run out of men before they do. If you cannot force them to a peace treaty, if they're willing to carry on the fight, they will beat you. And if you're on the charge, if you're on the offensive, then you can do very well. That's where the zeal, discipline, speed, cohesion, all of the things that the Caroleans know best, well, that's where they all matter the most. But when you get bogged down in a protracted firefight, well, the musket ball from a Russian conscript will kill a finely trained and equipped Carolean veteran just the same as it'll kill any other kind of soldier. And so too will disease kill your veterans, and the cold of winter, and the privation of a long campaign. And if the enemy is determined to see you defeated, and they start burning their own crops along your road of march, and if they continually raid your columns, attack your supply lines, well, they can afford to take those losses. And you cannot. Sound familiar? While you can point to something like the Battle of Poltava and show the weaknesses of how the Caroleans fought when applied to very particular circumstances, well, there are also going to be plenty of examples where the Caroleans overcame similar or worse odds. The real problem with the Carolean system was much larger than can ever be exposed in any individual battle, as is often the case with history. The entirety of the Great Northern War was a story of erosion, the slow whittling away of the Swedish forces. Even in victory after victory, they could not afford to continually replace the men that they were losing. The Caroleans were a small, elite fighting force, one of the most disciplined and capable ones of their day. Had they been fighting smaller wars, or 100 years earlier, then maybe things would have ended differently for them. But they were fighting in the 18th century, at the slow dawning of a new style of warfare. Armies were becoming more professional across the board, more standardized. They were becoming larger, more versatile, more modern. Logistics and the economy of scale were slowly but surely taking over the battlefields of Europe. Now, of course, this was a very large subject, that there were an awful lot of complexities that we were not able to discuss here. The greater niceties of how the Swedes fought.
We are just on the outro. I thoroughly enjoyed that, Jack. It was nice.
Very interesting to see the the differences between the armies that we've seen already and that particular one there.
Yeah, considering we've got a few more episodes to go over this series as well,
Yeah.
it was nice to sort of have a bit of that information moving forward as well. So we thoroughly enjoyed it, and we hope you guys did as well. If you did, you know what you need to do. You need to head over to our Patreon, because that link's in the description box down below. You can go see bonus content, extended clips, and everything you may think of. Go over there. If you enjoyed this content, the content creators link's going to be in the description box down below, and go check out some of their other content, and of course like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we will catch you in the next video.
See you later, guys.